Let's do it on a computer. Hi, y'all. Thank you for joining us. My name is Danielle Martinez. My pronouns are she, her, hers, she, her, ella. I am the outreach coordinator as well as the chair of the Sexual Assault Awareness Month for the RSC. Jorge, is your camera okay? It keeps going in and out.
My camera? Oh, yeah, just the lighting's a little weird in here.
I keep seeing your face go in and out. Anyways, y'all, I'm the outreach coordinator. This is Jorge Barraza. He's going to be alongside Farah, who's our intern in prevention, and then Rosemary, one of our volunteers. They're all kind of going to be doing this joint discussion on Beyond Sex Ed for the TikTok generation. This is a part of many webinars that we have planned for Sexual Assault Awareness Month. If you all don't know, April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and the entire goal is to raise awareness of what is sexual violence and what is sexual assault. Whether that be education, what does that look like, and as well as prevention, which is kind of the big, this is Jorge's field. So we're very excited to have our very own team join us. And we have a lot more events happening. So if you want to know those webinars, head over to theraperecoverycenter.org for more information. And this Wednesday, I want to put a plug, is Start by Believing Day. So it's a big social media push where we're going to ask folks to pledge that they stand with survivors and do that vocally, because we know that's very important. But yeah, without further ado, we have Jorge, the incredible, the one and only, the legend, the prevention coordinator. Jorge, it's your time to shine.
Thanks, Danny. Again, my name is Jorge Barraza. I'm the prevention coordinator here at Rape Recovery Center. And thank you very much for joining us today. If you know anybody who wasn't able to make it today, we will be recording this and uploading it to on YouTube and some of our social media sites. So you're welcome to share that as well, and we appreciate that. So today we're going to talk about Beyond Sex Ed, consent for the TikTok generation, and I'll talk a little bit about why we went with that title, Beyond Sex Ed, as we get into this. But let me go ahead and start by introducing myself. Okay, so my name is, again, Jorge Barraza, the prevention coordinator. I've been with the Rape Recovery Center about 2.5 years now. And as a prevention coordinator, something people don't always understand is that prevention means stopping something from even happening in the first place. A lot of times we think of prevention as, self-defense classes or telling someone how to say no, and that is all important. But the key thing is that we shouldn't be in a situation where we have to know self-defense classes or when we say no, that it's respected. So it's pretty complex. It's a lot of issues and it deals with a lot of different issues as well. So it's exciting work that I get to do. As you can see there, I actually haven't had a haircut since before the pandemic. So hopefully here we'll be out doing in-person presentations in the next couple of months, and I'll be going back to my regular look once that happens. But just a little bit about myself. I'm a graduate from the University of Utah, where I studied social work. I grew up in LA when I was like 16. We moved out here. It was a long time ago. And my favorite things are tacos. I like to eat, buy, sell, give away tacos. Tacos are the perfect food. And I also love music. Listening and making music are my hobbies. I own way too many guitars for my skill level, but it is something that I guess gives me a little bit of reprieve and rest and relaxation. Today we're also joined by Farah, my incredible intern. Farah, would you mind saying hi?
Hi everyone, my name is Farah. I am a student at the University of Utah, and I am so happy to be part of this amazing team.
And also with us today, we have an incredible volunteer, Rosemary. Rosemary, would you mind just saying hi? And maybe she took our 40-hour training almost a year ago. If you can talk a little bit about yourself and your experience with that training.
Yeah, I am a junior at the University of Utah. I'm a psychology major. I've had a lot of, when you go to college, there's a lot of conversations about, like the Rape Recovery Center gets brought up, but I wanted to learn more. And so I took the the 40-hour training, and I think it took about like a month. I think it was like a month, and it was awesome. I learned a bunch of information and resources that I had no idea even existed. And through that training, I was able to relay that information to my friends and to different people at the U. And I would highly recommend it for anybody who's interested. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Rosemary. And that's true. You know, I actually have worked at Utah Domestic Violence Coalition before this, so it's a very related field. They're very parallel in a lot of ways. And I had taken a 40-hour advocacy training with them, and it was. I kind of thought I probably knew most of it when I went into the sexual violence advocacy training, but I learned a lot from it. So there's definitely some different dynamics. And so if you're interested, UCASA offers those throughout the year. So you're welcome to look up UCASA, the Utah Coalition Against Sexual Assault, their website where they list upcoming trainings. So let's go ahead and get into this. So let's start off with what is consent? I think, you know, when I ask groups, when I ask people if they know what consent is, most people will nod or agree with that. When I ask exactly what is it, sometimes people have a little bit of harder time answering that question. So I always like to make sure we're clear on what consent is. So consent is, simply put, permission for something to happen or to do something. So that's pretty straightforward, right? And I think, you know, we all agree with that, but sometimes we still get in trouble or don't quite follow consent, or as like I say, sometimes say break consent. So we'll be talking about those situations a little bit. And then, like I said, why did we call this Beyond Sex Ed? And it's because consent is not just about romantic relationships or interactions or sex. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite quotes, which I repeat all the time, is, or it's a little meme I saw online some time ago, is that consent is a life skill that should be taught well before it has anything to do with sex. And in reality, you know, we practice consent all the time. It's all around us. We practice it with friends, with family, classmates, and even with strangers. So I don't like that very narrow way that we sometimes look at consent, because I think when we do that, we're kind of missing on opportunities where we're realizing that we can practice consent in a whole different way. And consent is not something we should just think about when it comes down to, like, say, sex or romantic relationships. In order to really create a culture of consent, which is one of my goals as a prevention coordinator, we have to think of consent all the time. It's not as difficult as it seems. It might seem like, oh man, something else I have to constantly think about, but it's not. It's just a matter of caring for other people and caring for ourselves. And that leads to, you know, why does consent matter? And, you know, I think consent matters because consent helps us avoid causing any damage, whether that's or hurt or pain, whether it's psychological or physical, to other people. And on the flip side, you know, it helps us to be safe when somebody practices consent with us. And so consent is really important. Like I said, we practice it all our life. I like to say, you know, there's consent when little kids, you know, share toys with each other. When you ask to borrow a pen, when you ask to take a picture of somebody, that's all consent as well. And the more we practice it in an intentional way, the easier it is to practice it in all contexts and situations. So one of the most important things that we can do, there's basically one of the keys to consent is identifying your own boundaries. What are the things that you're okay with? And the reason it's important to identify your boundaries is because when you know what you're okay with, it's easier to make decisions when you find yourself in maybe an uncomfortable or pressured situation. When you already know beforehand, you know, what your boundaries are. It's also important to recognize that our values shape what our boundaries are. And because of that, also, we have to understand that other people have different values. you could grow up in the same neighborhood, go to the same church, same school, and still have different values. So it's important that we respect other people's values as well and understand how our values shape our boundaries. So I'm not here to tell you what your boundaries should be or what your values should be, but I think understanding, the things that are important to you, your family, your religious beliefs, your social beliefs, all of these things help to shape what you're okay with. And when we're intentional about thinking about that, that helps us form them and be more concrete about them. So how do we identify our boundaries? The three simplest ways I always say is, one of them is just to make the time to think about it. Make the time to think about, what you're okay with, what you're not okay with, what are your boundaries. Another way that we identify them is when we talk about them. A lot of times we do it without, even unintentionally, we'll just talk about it with our friends or family. But talking it out can help you identify and solidify what your boundaries are, what you're okay with and what you're not. One great way also is writing it down. I actually find that writing things down helps me also kind of crystallize and think things out. Even if it's a paper that you're just going to throw away, I say, like, if you can, take the time to sit down and write down, what are your boundaries, and why they matter to you. And I think, again, that helps us with that, with identifying what those boundaries are. And so when we're thinking about those boundaries, I want you to think about, what things do you enjoy? What are you okay with? What things depend on the situation that you're in, or the context, and what things are never okay. I think a lot of times we think of boundaries and consent as a yes or no, a black or white, but in reality, very few things are very binary that way, right? Or a yes or no. A lot of times things are more of a spectrum. There are definitely some things that I'm more comfortable doing in some situations with some people, and not in other situations with other people. Hugging, for example, I enjoy hugs, but I don't enjoy a hug from a stranger. That's a little uncomfortable. So these kind of things, when you identify your boundaries, you have to recognize that it's not just a binary. There's a lot of situations where things might be comfortable or uncomfortable, for us. So it's good that we recognize that there is some nuance to it. It's not just yes or no situations. Another important thing when it comes to consent, it's two-sided. It's also understanding other people's boundaries, or thinking about that. So again, respecting the values of others, the fact that others may have values which don't align with ours. And a lot of times, I've actually seen situations when I'm talking about consent, and the person will say, oh, come on, that's not a big deal if I do this. But it is to that person. And when we're having that kind of an attitude of like, it's not that big of a deal, that's not practicing consent and helping to create, a culture of consent. So it's important that we do understand that other people have different values, and we should be okay with that. And identifying their boundaries, what are the other person's boundaries? I mean, you're not going to go around and ask every stranger what their boundaries are. Obviously, it's all contextual. But if you find yourself in a situation where it's appropriate, you should ask what you're okay with. And so, why it matters, why does it matter to identify other people's boundaries? Is, again, we don't want to cause harm to someone else, and it's too easy. And I think a lot of times people do get in trouble or cross boundaries or break consent because they don't identify the other person's boundaries. So how do you do it, right? How do you identify other people's boundaries? And some of it has to do with how we know people and our relationships with them. I think when we have a relationship where we know someone for a while, it can get to a point where you kind of understand somebody's body language. You can feel if someone's comfortable when they're not uncomfortable. But when in doubt, I always say the best way to know somebody else's boundaries is to communicate verbally and clearly. And I think sometimes we feel awkward about it, about being very direct, but I think it's important because, again, that's especially when you don't know someone that well, it can lead to you maybe crossing a boundary unknowingly. So just asking is always my preferred method. But again, there's always nuance, because if you know someone well, you may kind of know. By that same thing, by the same token, you don't want to assume. That's one of the first things of how to do this. You don't want to assume that someone's okay with something. And you want to ask what they're comfortable with. Is this okay? Is it okay if I give you a hug? And never try to convince someone to be okay with something. I always think, like, as soon as you try to convince someone, at that point, it's not really consensual anymore. And so that'll apply to all kinds of scenarios. Again, I'll give an example of a situation that I found really interesting. One of the first times I gave a presentation on consent when I was working with Rape Recovery Center was at a middle school. And I'm talking about consent and why it matters and how to do it. And the students were all nodding, going along, they're engaged, they appreciate what I'm saying, and they seem to all be behind me, behind what I'm saying and what it's all about. And at one point, one of the students raises her hand and asked, well, what about, Fridays when everyone goes around and slaps everyone in the butt? And I was a little shocked. I'm like, really, Fridays? I'm like, does anyone else know about this? And all the students, they were shocked that this person even said it out loud. And they were kind of giggling and embarrassed, but they raised their hand. Almost all of them knew about it. I looked over to the teacher. I said, were you aware of this? And she's like, no, I wasn't. And I'm like, wow, how long has it been going on? I'm like, it's always happened here. Like, that's interesting. And so since then, when I've gone to middle or high schools, every time I go, I bring that up. I say, have you heard of this tradition where on Fridays everyone goes around and slaps other people's butts? We go around slapping everybody's butts. And almost without fail, every place I go to, students are like, yes, oh man. In most middle schools, they'll say, yes, it's still happening. Most high schools, they're like, well, we did in middle school. Are they still doing it? I'm like, yeah, it still happens. And so we're talking about this in one of my high school presentations and one of my middle school presentations. And as I'm talking about this girl raises her hand and says that, well, I only do it to my best friend. I don't do it to just anybody. So there's no harm there. I mean, it's just that one friend, and we're really close. Her friend was there, and she spoke on, and she said, you know what? I've actually never felt comfortable with that. I just didn't feel comfortable saying anything about it. And these were best friends. So I find it always interesting that a lot of times we will make assumptions. So even in that situation, they were best friends, but one of them was assuming the other person was okay with it. And the other person was not, but didn't feel comfortable. So I think another part of other people's boundaries is not only understanding them or, asking or being direct, but also making the space and making sure that they're comfortable being honest about their boundaries. It's easy to sometimes find yourself in a situation where you feel like you should say yes, or you should say no to something when you feel the other way. So as friends, as people, we should be trying to create that space. Again, that's part of creating that consent culture, or culture of consent, is making it safe to say yes and to say no to different situations, or even to say, let's talk some more about it. That's all part of respect. Again, it's not always so black and white. So when it comes to identifying other people's boundaries, again, these are the things we should be trying to understand. What things do they enjoy? What things depend on the situation for them? And what things are never okay with that person? So it's the same as what we do with ourselves. Because I like to say, consent isn't just about protecting yourself. Consent is about protecting other people as well. And that's what we want to be doing on that. As a matter of fact, I was speaking with Farah a little bit before this, and I asked her, like, in your opinion, Farah, like, why does consent matter? Would you mind speaking a little bit to that?
Yeah, I think consent really matters because everyone has their own autonomy, and it's really important to respect that. I don't think it's fair to assume that something that you're okay with will be okay for someone else. And like you mentioned earlier, just respecting boundaries and practicing consent, it really does prevent a lot of hurt and a lot of pain. And I just think people should be respected. And yeah, it is important. And if we want people to respect our own boundaries, we should be respecting the boundaries of other people, as well as not dismissing their boundaries. And if we have crossed it, not invalidating it as well.
And it's really easy sometimes, right, to kind of say like, well, it's not a big deal. It's because we're talking about causing harm or hurt to other people. It doesn't always have to be that extreme. Sometimes just making someone uncomfortable. I mean, is that really what we want? To make people feel uncomfortable in a space. So I think that's again what kind of why we want this healthier kind of society or uh, culture of consent. So how do we practice consent? I mean, I've talked a little bit about it already, but the two key things are to know and communicate your boundaries and to learn and respect the boundaries of others. I think sometimes we can get caught up overthinking it. I think it's good to think about these things beforehand, like I said, and plan, but at the end of the day, it is just about those two things. I want people to know and respect my boundaries, and I want to know and respect the boundaries of others. Going back to what a little bit of what Farah said, it made me think of something. When we're discounting other people's boundaries or saying like, oh, it's not a big deal. That reminds me of that golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto yourself. And but my only problem I have with that golden rule is that that's based on what you're comfortable with. A couple of years ago, I heard somebody say, well, there's the platinum rule. And the platinum rule is do unto others as they would have you do unto them. Which is again, it's taken into context, it's into the calculation, what is the other person comfortable with, right? And the same thing would apply to you. What am I comfortable with? And how do I want to be respected? And sometimes again, it can be very easy to discount other people's boundaries, but it's important that we're conscious of that and create that healthier culture that we're in. So consent can look, typically when we talk about consent, we do talk about consent in real life, those situations where it's, hugging someone or kissing someone or even like, again, sharing something or using an item somebody else might have. And a lot of times we do think of consent again in sexual or romantic situations, but consent in real life really is about a lot of things, like I mentioned. So what does consent look like in real life? What are those situations that we have where consent matters, and where do they start? Again, I think they start from when they're very little. And a lot of times I will get parents who want me to talk to their youth about consent. And that's great, but I really think this is a conversation we all need to have. And I think we should be comfortable having these conversations with our children, and us and youth should be comfortable having that conversation with the parents as well. It's not always the case, but it is important, I think, that we strive for that. Because again, these are things that we learn throughout our entire life. Again, when it comes to consent in real life, we can cause hurt, damage, or make someone feel uncomfortable, or that can happen to us. So that's why consent matters. And the way consent looks, again, it can be, body language, it can be, verbal consent or lack of consent as well. Something I like to say is, for a long time, we've talked about consent. It's like no means no, right? When somebody says no, you should stop. But I like to go with more positive, or somewhat call affirmative consent, which means yes. instead of just, assuming something's okay unless the person says no, we should ask for a yes before anything happens. So instead of just hugging someone and waiting to see if they say no, we should ask them, is it okay if I give you a hug? And I'll be honest, a lot of times it can be uncomfortable to ask, but I think it's just, again, because we don't see it modeled in TV shows and online and media. Everything is just kind of, people know already. It's magic, whether it's a kiss in a Disney movie or anything else. You never see verbal consent or affirmative consent take place. But once you practice it, it really is not awkward at all. And if anything, whenever I practice it, I tend to get a lot of compliments on, like, wow, thank you. Thank you for asking me and not assuming I was okay with that, even when they were not okay with a hug or whatever situation it may be. So again, we should be thinking about consent all the time. Do you have any thoughts on consent in real life, Farah? Any experiences that you care to share or kind of insights?
Yeah, I have a few stories actually. So I remember I told you about what happened to me at my middle school. Is it okay if I share that story?
It's up to you, yeah, if you're comfortable.
Yeah, so we were in gym class and girls would go around punching each other in the boob. And it was really weird because it was like, like boundaries are obviously being crossed. And I think they thought it was okay because it wasn't like a guy doing it to a girl, it was a girl doing it to another girl. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of pain and discomfort. And I just think it goes to show that anyone can cross each other's boundaries, friends, classmates, peers. But also, I think it's really important to talk about children and consent because if you tell a child to do something, if you are an adult, there's like a power position. And, like if I tell like a kid to give me a hug, they might feel obligated to give me a hug because I am bigger than them. I am an adult, they're a child. But I think a better way to approach it is giving control to them and asking like, hey, like, do you want a hug? And just teaching them that they have control over their own body. And if they don't want to do something, they don't have to. And I think that's a really important conversation to have with kids too.
Yeah, and that's something I practice even like with my kids. It's like, hey, is it okay if I have a hug, or someone like that? And it's something like that. And it's interesting, right? Because I know in my culture, my descendants my parents are Mexican. We have this culture where a lot of families have this tradition where when a child comes into a family gathering, they're required to give everybody a hug in the room. And that's not comfortable, right? If there's might be someone that you feel creepy around or don't feel so great about. So it's important that we give that space to others to be able to decide whether they want to do something or not. And hopefully, as youth, you're in a situation where you can speak up and maybe speak to a parent or something like, say, like, this is why I don't feel comfortable, when you do recognize a situation where maybe, you're feeling obliged to do something. So hopefully you have that opportunity to speak up, with parents or caregivers as well about those things. And then something we want to talk about again today as well was just consent online. What does that look like? Because honestly, it's something that I had to ask Farah to give me a hand with, because her being younger, she's definitely grown up more in this online world that we have, and understanding what consent looks like online. And it can be interesting. I think even for people who do practice it, who are more, have grown up in this online generation, you could say, we don't always think of what consent actually looks like online. So what does that look like? And why does it matter? And I think, when we talk about consent, again, we think a lot of times in real life what that looks like, but consent online can also cause harm and pain and discomfort for people. So it's one of those things we do want to also be conscious about. And this is an area where I have seen a lot of youth might be like, oh, that's not a big deal about that. So Farah, would you mind talking a little bit about what you've learned about, online consent as you've kind of prepared for this and thought about it?
Yeah, so for me, I understand online consent as giving consent for someone to take your content and share it, as well as asking permission to use someone's content. And that can also look like tagging a friend in a photo. Maybe they don't want to have an online presence, or maybe they don't feel comfortable with a certain photo being out there. So I think um, just sharing um, sharing content online, but also taking it as well is the basis for online consent. But again, just emphasizing that you should be able to give permission to someone, and they should be able to give permission to you to tag them in a photo or to use their content.
Yeah, creating that space, right, where the person feels comfortable, and having that space where you can feel comfortable saying what you're okay with and what you're not. The first time I really thought about online consent was a couple of years ago. I took my teenage daughter out to eat to a taco joint, of course, because like I said, I love tacos. And so she was loving the food. She takes a picture of the tacos, and as she's about to share, she's like, "Hey, Dad, is it okay if I tag you on this post?" And it kind of took me back a little, like, I was like, yeah, sure. I'm like, thanks for asking. And no one's ever asked that before. And it made me realize sometimes you don't want the public to know where you're at or what your experiences are or who you've been with. Uh, so, practicing consent in that way is huge. And it's something she's gone on to like teach her friends about, because she has been tagged at times when she doesn't want to be tagged. And so think about it for yourself. Like, what are situations where or reasons why you might not want everyone to know where you're at or what you're doing or who you're with. There can be a lot of situations like that. So consent online definitely, can involve that. Sending images or receiving images without consent obviously can be a real problem. And again, as Farah said, using someone's content, I would say a person's likeness, so like a photo of a person or even their name, like in tagging or something like that, is also part of that online consent. And I think it's important that we practice it again, because these things relate to how we live our life in real life too. I think consent is not something you can just say, I'm only going to practice consent in these situations and not think about it any other time. I think we practice consent. We have to practice consent, in our everyday activities, and that's not making your life more complicated. It actually makes your life less complicated, because when you consistently practice consent, you don't have to even think about it. It's just the way you operate. And ideally, that's what we want. That's that culture of consent, where consent is just like the default. That's what we do. It's not something we have to like stop and think about. We actually just practice healthy consent all the time. So, but obviously that's not the world we live in, right? Consent is, as I like to say, broken or not practiced all the time. And so I like to kind of think about why is it that we sometimes do break consent, as I say. I think one of the things that we most commonly think about when someone doesn't follow or practice consent is that they're selfish and don't care about others. And I think we can all be guilty of that sometimes, maybe lacking some empathy towards other people. And, I don't care what they want. I know what I want, and I'm going to get it no matter what. And again, this can look very different. Everything from little kids sharing toys, again, to even situations, whether it's a romantic situation or sex is involved. But, just saying like, this is what I care about. But in my experience, and I'm sure in most of your experiences, that's not the case. Most people are not selfish. Most people do care about others. So if that's the case, why does it happen too? And again, not that these situations don't happen, where someone is selfish or doesn't care about others, but in most of us do care. So if that's the case, why does it happen anyways? And these are the things where I kind of challenge you to think about yourself. First of all, check that off. Am I being selfish? am I not caring about what the other person feels or cares about? And then the other way that sometimes that happens is that we assume that the other person is okay with something. Again, I shared that example about best friends where one had assumed for, a while now that her friend was okay with being slapped in the butt by her. And it wasn't until we had that situation where we were able to talk about it and verbally talk about these things and express our feelings that she figured out that her friend was not okay with what was going on. So that's the other thing we have to check ourselves on. Are we assuming the other person's okay with it? And I think sometimes that comes from assuming that the other person shares the same values that we do. You can have best friends that don't share the same values completely. Any two people in the same family, you can have people who they may have the same values, but internalize them or understand them slightly differently. So they might be okay with some things and not with others. So again, never assume. And what I also see is, just poor communication or misunderstanding, where people maybe they're embarrassed to ask, so that leads to assuming, or maybe they're assuming that certain body language means something. And again, that goes back to the more you know a person, the easier it is to maybe understand what their body language means, what they're when they're saying yes or no to something. But I always say the best way to communicate is to communicate openly and verbally. So, ask and make sure the other person feels comfortable saying no. So how do you make someone else feel comfortable? I don't know, Farah, how would you say that you make someone feel comfortable when you ask them something? How do you create that space?
I think just the action of asking itself, because that shows that you are taking into consideration the other person's boundaries and feelings. I think that is an excellent way to start by creating a safe space, but also talking about your own expectations for the relationship in terms of consent. That goes for friendships, romantic relationships, even siblings and parents. I think just being open to having the conversation, but also being willing to listen to it as well.
And I think you can also even verbally let the person know it's okay to say no or to disagree with something. Saying like, hey, do you want to do this? And if you don't, it's fine. That can go a long way too, to making sure the person doesn't feel like, I better say yes to this, or I better go to this event when I don't want to do it. So again, I think that very direct, affirmative kind of verbal communication is the best way to go when it comes to consent. But again, we're not perfect. We do sometimes cross boundaries, or don't practice consent. And so when that happens, it's important that we deal with it in an appropriate way. And the reason that is because not only may we've caused harm or damage or discomfort to someone else, we should, help them feel better and make sure they're okay. And so when we're crossing boundaries, it can be at all kinds of levels. I mean, again, when we talk about consent, a lot of people think of, sex or romantic relationships. And those can lead to some boundaries that are crossed that can be very traumatic, very painful, but also just with friends. Let's say I posted I tagged someone online and they didn't want to, and it caused them some issues with their family or whatever, or with a friend. How are we going to deal with that? And again, there's a whole spectrum of experiences that we can have, a whole range of experiences that we can have that can cause different levels of pain or harm or discomfort. So when it's something, if someone has crossed one of your boundaries, and if it's like, say, a friend or a sibling or someone that you feel comfortable addressing with, then that is typically the best way to do that. Say, hey, when you did that, it made me feel uncomfortable, and try to get the person to understand, what has happened. But that's not always the case, right? Sometimes it is something maybe more severe, or a person that you don't feel comfortable speaking to. I see this a lot with, say, like bullying, for example. A person who's experiencing bullying may not feel comfortable, going up to their bully and saying, "Hey, please stop." uh, so at that point, I think we can discuss with a trusted person. That can be a friend, a parent, a caregiver, a teacher, counselors, someone else that you feel that you can talk to, and and sometimes that's important too, because that helps us to realize what is it that I really need to feel better in the situation. And hopefully you do have someone that you trust. And if you haven't thought about it, take a moment to think about that. Who is someone that I would feel comfortable talking to in different situations? It's not always going to be the same person either. For some situations, it may be your best friend. For some situations, it may be parent or caregiver or a teacher, depending on what the situation is. And when you're doing that, again, think about what do I need? And you have a right to speak up for what you need and what makes you feel uncomfortable. And on the other side, and I think this is an issue I see a lot with not just youth and adults as well, is that when we get called out for having crossed somebody else's boundary or not having practiced consent, a lot of times we try to get defensive or explain why we did something or why we didn't do something. Well, what we should be doing is just taking responsibility for that and saying, I'm sorry, what can I do? It's, instead of trying to twist it around and say like, well, it's because you did this, or it's because you did that, or it's because you were okay with it before. None of that is, okay. Consent, I like to say, is ongoing. It's not something you get once and it's a free pass forever. Consent is something that you should always be checking in on. And so when someone does say you feel uncomfortable, instead of getting defensive or trying to blame them or someone else, it's important that we take responsibility for our actions and the impact that they had on someone else. And then, when that's the case, like I said, we should lend support. Also understand, and this is going back to, like, say, if you cross somebody else's boundaries. I've had situations where a person who has crossed somebody else's boundaries wants to apologize, but the person who was hurt does not care for an apology from that person. In those situations, that person who wants to apologize sometimes will get upset, like, oh, look, I'm trying my best. It's not your place to be upset in that situation. If that person does not want that apology, you have to respect that. We have to be accountable, and we can lend support, but if it's not needed, or not wanted, we definitely can't force it. But also letting support is important when we find out about somebody else, maybe who has had an issue and they come up to you and say, like, this happened and I don't feel uncomfortable. It's important that we're thinking of how do we support, not what should that person do or what should I tell them to do. That's not helpful. What you want to do is say, how can I support you? How can I help you? There's nothing wrong with saying, would you want to do this, or giving some person options, but never tell them you should do this, or let's go do this, or let's go tell this person, or let's do that. I want to say, like, what do you need in this situation? What would make you feel better? And that's important, that we lend support instead of telling the person what to do. And sometimes when things are more serious and it is something more traumatic, again, I work with a rape recovery center, so I deal with some very difficult situations that are very traumatic. And even myself, sometimes I don't know quite what to do. So at that point, I'll refer to an expert. Again, I'm not telling the person, do this or do that. I'll just say, I know this phone number you can call and get some information, or I know this person who works on that. Is that something you would be interested in? And just listen, lend support, and know, when, or know options that are out there and how to refer to them, and accept what the person says that they want or need at that time. Because again, unfortunately, in an ideal world, this would not be something we have to deal with, but it does. And so when it does, it's important that we respond in an appropriate way to make sure everyone, is as okay as possible, that people can recover from the situation, maybe learn from it when possible. So that's all that I have when it comes to, consent, in situations. If there's any questions, please feel free to chat them in there. Time I've been in the chat. Rosemary's monitoring that. And we also provide these kind of presentations for middle and high schools, and really for the general population as well. We're always glad to tailor a presentation for any group. But if you know of anybody, any friends that might, want to talk about this, or if you want to talk about, say, with friends or family, again, this will be available as a recording. I think it's a great place to start the conversation. Obviously, this is not all encompassing, and this is not everything about consent, but it's definitely a beginning to the conversation. So again, if you have any questions, please type them on the chat, and Rosemary will let us know what's happening. We'll go from there. Also, my information is available on our website, raperecoverycenter.org. And so if you go under About Us tab, there's information there on our staff, and you can find me there on the website. You're welcome to email me if you have any questions or any requests for presentations as well. And Danny, I know that you're just a host here. That's bringing me on. Thank you for the opportunity to do this. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts.
Yes. No, I am just the host. No, I guess just to kind of give some context, thank you, not context. Thank you to Farah, Jorge, and Rosemary for doing this. But I think a big part of SAM that really came out of the pandemic, I mean, we're still in a pandemic, was and to the theme, right, digital consent and how that whole looks like, was how do we navigate, right, these spaces and drawing boundaries, especially as kind of the times change and how that looks like, and how do we kind of do that. So I'm really thankful that you all were honest in trying to have a conversation about how that looks like, especially online. We have a couple of more events going on, especially like how to teach your kids how to do online consent, so more younger children, especially as they're doing Zoom classes, or they're maybe on their tablets a little bit more. If you're on Tinder, how do you do that? How do you support survivors during a pandemic, right? So as we shift to a much more digital space, how does that look like? And how do we remain and keep those boundaries of consent? So I'm really excited. Thank you all for holding this space, and we appreciate it.
And people, I know sometimes people reach out to me as if I'm some expert on consent, and I would say, I'm not an expert. I guess to some extent I should step in and embrace it to some extent. That is what I do for a living, right? I talk about these things, but consent isn't about what Jorge says. Consent is a conversation that it's so individual and contextual to, each and every one of your relationships. So I can give you a framework, or we can, have some talking points, but at the end of the day, it's how you communicate with those around you and what those boundaries are for that relationship in that situation. So that's what I challenge you to do, not just in the moment where something bad is happening. Try to think about it beforehand and have those conversations when you can.
And with folks, thank you, Jorge, for bringing that up. It looks very different for every single person. And for you and every single person, right? It completely different at every point. Always, when in doubt, ask it out. I don't know if that's a saying.
No, but it should be.
It is now. It is now. When in doubt, ask it out.
Like, I have 4 kids, and I know that their relationships are very different between them. There's like some that share everything and like they're on the same wavelength constantly and they understand each other, and some are a little bit more like, I still love you, but my relationship with you is different than that. So just because they're all siblings doesn't mean that they have the same relationship.
Mm-hmm. Very true.
Well, thank you again for being here. If you have any questions, again, feel free to ask in the chat. I'll stay along here for a few more minutes, and we'll make this available online soon. So any closing comments you have, Danielle? Or?
No, just please keep up on our social media. Everything's digital. So all of our events for Sexual Assault Awareness Month are digital. So if you want to see what we're up to, take a look there. And thank you all for joining. And again, Jorge and I will stay on after if anyone has any other questions or any thoughts or concerns they want to kind of say outside of the group. Thanks, y'all. I'm going to stop recording now.
Yeah, might as well.
Thank you, Dheeraj.